Nothing like this had ever happened to Shasta in his life before. He had never even imagined lying on anything so comfortable as that sofa, or drinking anything so delicious as that sherbet. He was still wondering what had happened to the others, and how on earth he was going to escape and meet them in the tombs, and what would happen when the real Corin turned up again. But none of these worries seemed so pressing now that he was comfortable, and perhaps later on there would be nice things to eat. Meanwhile, the people in that cool, airy room were very interesting. Besides the fawn, there were two dwarfs, a kind of creature he had never seen before, and a very large raven. The rest were all humans, grown-ups, but young, and all of them, both men and women, had nicer faces and voices than most colormans. And soon Shasta found himself taking an interest in the conversation. "Now, madam," the king was saying to Queen Susan, the lady who had kissed Shasta, "what think you? We have been in this city fully 3 weeks. Have you yet settled in your mind whether you will marry this dark-faced lover of yours, this Prince Rabadash, or no?" The lady shook her head. "No, brother," she said, "not for all the jewels in Tashbaan." Hello, thought Shasta, although they're king and queen, they're brother and sister, not married to one another. "Truly, sister," said the king, "I should have loved you the less if you had taken him. And I tell you that at the first coming of the Tisrock's ambassador into Narnia to treat of this marriage, and later when the prince was our guest at Cair Paravel, it was a wonder to me that you ever could find it in your heart to show him so much favor." "That was my folly, Edmund," said Queen Susan, "of which I cry you mercy. Yet when he was with us in Narnia, truly this prince bore himself in another fashion than he does now in Tashbaan. For I take you all to witness what marvelous feats he did in that high tournament and hastilitude which our brother the king made for him, and how meekly and courteously he consorted with us in the space of 7 days. But here in his own city he has shown another face." "Ah," croaked the raven, "it is an old saying, 'See the bear in his own den before you judge of its conditions.'" "That's very true, Swallowpad," said one of the dwarfs, "and another is, 'Come live with me, and you'll know me.'" "Yes," said the king, "we have now seen him for what he is. That is, a most proud, bloody, luxurious, cruel, and self-pleasing tyrant." "Then in the name of Aslan," said Susan, "let us leave this Tashbaan this very day." "There's the rub, sister," said Edmund, "for now I must open to you all that has been growing in my mind these last 2 days and more. Paradin, of your courtesy, look to the door, and see that there is no spy upon us. All well? So, for now we must be secret." Everyone had begun to look very serious. Queen Susan jumped up and ran to her brother. "Oh, Edmund," she cried, "what is it? There is something dreadful in your face." Chapter 5. Prince Corin. "My dear sister and very good lady," said King Edmund, "you must now show your courage, for I tell you plainly we are in no small danger." "What is it, Edmund?" asked the queen. "It is this," said Edmund. "I do not think we shall find it easy to leave Tashbaan. While the prince had hoped that you would take him, we were honored guests. But by the lion's mane, I think that as soon as he has your flat denial, we shall be no better than prisoners." One of the dwarfs gave a low whistle. "I warned you, your majesties, I warned you," said Salopad the raven. "Easily in, but not easily out, as the lobster said in the lobster pot." "I have been with the prince this morning," continued Edmund. "He is little used, more's the pity, to having his will crossed, and he is very chafed at your long delays and doubtful answers. This morning he pressed very hard to know your mind. I put it aside, meaning at the same time to diminish his hopes, with some light common jests about women's fancies, and hinted that his suit was likely to grow cold. He grew angry and dangerous. There was a sort of threatening, though still veiled under a show of courtesy, in every word he spoke." "Yes," said Tumnus, "and when I supped with the Grand Vizier last night it was the same. He asked me how I liked Tashbaan, and I, for I could not tell him I hated every stone of it, and I would not lie, told him that now, when high summer was coming on, my heart turned to the cool woods and dewy slopes of Narnia. He gave a smile that meant no good, and said, 'There is nothing to hinder you from dancing there again, little Goatfoot, always provided you leave us in exchange a bride for our prince.'" "Do you mean he would make me his wife by force?" exclaimed Susan. "That's my fear, Susan," said Edmund, "wife or slave, which is worse." "But how can he? Does the Tisrock think our brother the High King would suffer such an outrage?" "Sire," said Paradin to the king, "they would not be so mad. Do they think there are no swords and spears in Narnia?" Alas, said Edmund, my guess is that the Tisroc has very small fear of Narnia. We are a little land, and little lands on the borders of a great empire were always hateful to the lords of the great empire. He longs to blot them out, gobble them up. When first he suffered the prince to come to Cair Paravel, sister, it may be that he was only seeking an occasion against us. More likely, he hopes to make one mouthful of Narnia and Archenland both. Let him try, said the second dwarf. At sea we are as big as he is, and if he assaults us by land, he has the desert to cross. True, friend, said Edmund, but is a desert a sure defense? What does Salopad say? I know that desert well, said the raven, for I have flown above it far and wide in my younger days. You may be sure that Shasta pricked up his ears at this point. And this is certain, that if the Tisroc goes by the great oasis, he can never lead a great army across it into Archenland. For though they could reach the oasis by the end of their first day's march, yet the springs there would be too little for the thirst of all those soldiers and their beasts. But there is another way. Shasta listened more attentively still. He that would find that way, said the raven, must start from the tombs of the ancient kings and ride northwest so that the double peak of Mount Pyre is always straight ahead of him. And so in a day's riding or a little more, he shall come to the head of a stony valley, which is so narrow that a man might be within a furlong of it 1,000 times and never know that it was there. And looking down this valley, he will see neither grass nor water nor anything else good. But if he rides on down it, he will come to a river and can ride by the water all the way into Archenland. And do the Calormans know of this western way? Asked the queen. Friends, friends, said Edmund, what is the use of all this discourse? We are not asking whether Narnia or Calormen would win if war arose between them. We are asking how to save the honor of the queen and our own lives out of this devilish city. For though my brother, Peter the High King, defeated the Tisroc 12 times over, yet long before that day our throats would be cut, and the queen's grace would be the wife, or more likely the slave of this prince. We have our weapons, king, said the first dwarf, and this is a reasonably defensible house. As to that, said the king, I do not doubt that every one of us would sell our lives dearly at the gate, and they would not come at the queen but over our dead bodies. Yet we should be merely rats fighting in a trap when all's said. Very true, croaked the raven. These last stands in a house make good stories, but nothing ever came of them. After their first few repulses, the enemy always sets the house on fire. I am the cause of all of this, said Susan, bursting into tears. Oh, if only I had never left Cair Paravel. Our last happy day was before those ambassadors came from Calormen. The moles were planting an orchard for us, and oh, and she buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Courage, Sue, courage, said Edmund. Remember, but what is the matter with you, Mr. Tumnus? For the fawn was holding both his horns with his hands as if he were trying to keep his head on by them, and writhing to and fro as if he had a pain on his inside. Don't speak to me, said Tumnus. I'm thinking so that I can hardly breathe. Wait, do wait. There was a moment's puzzled silence, and then the fawn looked up, drew a long breath, mopped his forehead, and said, The only difficulty is how we get down to our ship, with some stores too, without being seen and stopped. Yes, said a dwarf dryly, just as a beggar's only difficulty about riding is that he has no horse. Wait, said Mr. Tumnus impatiently. All we need is some pretext for going down to our ship today and taking stuff on board. Yes, said King Edmund doubtfully. Well then, said the fawn, how would it be if your majesties bade the prince to a great banquet to be held on board our own galleon, the Splendor Hyaline, tomorrow night? And let the message be worded as graciously as the queen can contrive without pledging her honor, so as to give the prince a hope that she is weakening. This is very good counsel, sir, croaked the raven. And then, continued Tumnus excitedly, everyone will expect us to be going down to the ship all day, making preparations for our guests. And let us go to some of the bazaars and spend every minute we have at the fruitiers and the sweetmeat sellers and the wine merchants, just as we would if we were really giving a feast. And let us order magicians and jugglers and dancing girls and flute players, all to be on board tomorrow night. I see, said King Edmund, rubbing his hands. And then, said Tumnus, we'll all be on board tonight, and as soon as it is quite dark, up the sails and out the oars, said the king. And so to sea, said Tumnus, leaping up and beginning to dance. And our nose northward, said the dwarf. "Running for home, hurrah for Narnia and the North," said the other dwarf. "And the prince waking the next morning and finding his birds flown," said Peridin, clapping his hands. "Oh, Master Tumnus, dear Master Tumnus," said the queen, catching his hands and swinging with him as he danced, "you have saved us all." "The prince will chase us," said another lord, whose name Shasta had not heard. "That's the least of my fears," said Edmund. "I have seen all the shipping in the river, and there's no tall ship of war nor swift galley there. I wish he may chase us, for the Splendor Hyline could sink anything he has to send after her, if we were overtaken at all." "Sire," said the raven, "you shall hear no better plot than the fawn's, though we sat in council for 7 days. And now, as we birds say, nests before eggs, which is as much to say, let us all take our food and then at once be about our business." Everyone rose at this, and the doors were opened, and the lords and creatures stood aside for the king and queen to go out first. Shasta wondered what he ought to do, but Mr. Tumnus said, "Lie there, your highness, and I will bring you up a little feast to yourself in a few moments. There's no need for you to move until we are all ready to embark." Shasta laid his head down on the pillows, and soon he was alone in the room. "This is perfectly dreadful," thought Shasta. It never came into his head to tell these Narnians the whole truth and ask for their help. Having been brought up by a hard, close-fisted man like Arshish, he had a fixed habit of never telling grown-ups anything if he could help it. He thought they would always spoil or stop whatever you were trying to do. And he thought that even if the Narnian king might be friendly to the 2 horses because they were talking beasts of Narnia, he would hate Erebus because she was a collarmine, and either sell her for a slave or send her back to her father. As for himself, "I simply daren't tell them I'm not Prince Corin now," thought Shasta. "I've heard all their plans. If they knew I wasn't one of themselves, they'd never let me out of this house alive. They'd be afraid I'd betray them to the Tisroc. They'd kill me. And if the real Corin turns up, it'll all come out, and they will." He had, you see, no idea of how noble and free-born people behave. "What am I to do? What am I to do?" he kept saying to himself. "What, hello, here comes that goaty little creature again." The fawn trotted in, half dancing, with a tray in its hands, which was nearly as large as himself. This he set on an inlaid table beside Shasta's sofa, and sat himself down on the carpeted floor with his goaty legs crossed. "Now, princeling," he said, "make a good dinner. It will be your last meal in Tajban." It was a fine meal after the collarmine fashion. I don't know whether you would have liked it or not, but Shasta did. There were lobsters and salad and snipe stuffed with almonds and truffles and a complicated dish made of chicken livers and rice and raisins and nuts. And there were cool melons and gooseberry fools and mulberry fools and every kind of nice thing that can be made with ice. There was also a little flagon of the sort of wine that is called white, though it is really yellow. While Shasta was eating, the good little fawn, who thought he was still dazed with sunstroke, kept talking to himself about the fine times he would have when they all got home, with his good old father, King Loon of Archenland, and the little castle where he lived in the southern slopes of the pass. "And don't forget," said Mr. Tumnus, "that you are promised your first suit of armor and your first war horse on your next birthday. And then your highness will begin to learn how to tilt and joust. And in a few years, if all goes well, King Peter has promised your royal father that he himself will make you a knight at Cair Paravel. And in the meantime, there will be plenty of comings and goings between Narnia and Archenland across the neck of the mountains. And of course you remember you have promised to come for a whole week to stay with me for the summer festival, and there will be bonfires and all-night dances of fauns and dryads in the heart of the woods, and who knows, we may see Aslan himself." When the meal was over, the fawn told Shasta to stay quietly where he was, and it wouldn't do you any harm to have a little sleep, he added. "I'll call you in plenty of time to get on board. And then home, Narnia and the North." Shasta had so enjoyed his dinner and all the things Tumnus had been telling him that when he was left alone, his thoughts took a different turn. He only hoped now that the real Prince Corin would not turn up until it was too late, and that he would be taken away by ship to Narnia. I am afraid he did not think at all of what might happen to the real Corin if he was left behind in Tajban. He was a little worried about Erebus and Bree waiting for him at the tombs, but then he said to himself, "Well, how can I help it? And, anyway, that Erebus thinks she's too good to go about with me, so she can jolly well go alone." And at the same time, he couldn't help feeling that it would be much nicer going to Narnia by sea than toiling across the desert.